Mira-chan was 12 years old, and she had never been good at staying where she was told to stay. Her parents always said that curiosity would get her into trouble someday. And they were probably right, but Mira could not help herself because the universe was too big and too strange and too wonderful to simply sit still and wait for answers to come to her. She lived aboard the Hearthfire, a salvage vessel that her parents had operated for 15 years in the outer regions of conclave space, and every day brought new wonders drifting through the void. The conclave was an alliance of 12 ancient alien species who had ruled the galaxy for longer than humans had existed as a species, and they viewed humanity with a mixture of amusement and concern because humans were young and reckless and asked too many questions. Myra did not care what the conclave thought because she had seen the way their inspectors looked at her family like they were children playing with dangerous toys, and she knew that being underestimated was sometimes an advantage. On this particular day, her parents were occupied with a conclave inspector named Vareth, who had 4 arms and skin like polished stone and a voice that made everything sound like a lecture about safety regulations. Myra was supposed to wait in her quarters, but the sensors on her personal tablet had picked up something strange in a nearby asteroid cluster, and she could not resist the urge to investigate. She slipped away to the maintenance bay, where a small exploration pod waited like a loyal pet eager for adventure. The pod was barely larger than a closet, but Mira had learned to pilot it before she learned to ride a bicycle, and she guided it out of the Hearthfire with practiced ease while her parents argued with Vareth about licensing fees. The asteroid cluster was unremarkable according to Conclave records, which described it as surveyed and empty and not worth the fuel to investigate further, but Mira had learned that Conclave records were not always complete because the elder races had a habit of ignoring things they did not understand. Her sensors picked up the energy signature again, and it was faint like a heartbeat heard through a thick wall, but it was definitely there, pulsing from within one of the larger asteroids. Mira guided her pod closer, and she saw that the asteroid was not natural at all, but hollow with an opening just large enough for her tiny vessel to slip through inside. She found darkness at first, but then her lights revealed something that made her breath catch in her throat. A ship rested within the asteroid like a pearl hidden inside an oyster, but it was unlike any ship Myra had ever seen or imagined. It was not built from metal or composite materials, but grown from something organic that looked almost like bone wrapped in dried membranes, and the curves of its hull suggested a living creature frozen in mid-flight. Myra's tablet estimated the ship's age based on radiation decay, and the number it displayed made her think the device was broken because it read 47,000 years old. That was impossible because the oldest spacefaring civilization in Conclave records had only achieved interstellar travel 20,000 years ago, and yet here was proof that someone had been sailing between the stars when humanity's ancestors were still learning to paint on cave walls. The ship was dead and dark, except for one section near what Mira guessed was the front, where a faint light pulsed in a rhythm that reminded her of breathing. She docked her pod against the hull, and the outer membrane parted for her like it had been waiting for a visitor, and she stepped into air that was stale but breathable and warm, despite the cold of space outside. The interior of the ship was beautiful in a way that made Myra feel sad because she could see how elegant it must have been when it was alive and functioning. But now the walls were gray, and the passages were silent, and everything felt like a tomb. She followed the light because that was what curious children did, and it led her to a chamber at the heart of the ship, where a console made of crystallized something glowed with soft blue radiance. Myra approached slowly, and she saw that the console displayed patterns that might have been writing but in no language. She recognized, and the pattern shifted and changed as if responding to her presence. She knew she should not touch it because her parents had taught her that unknown alien technology could be dangerous, but her hand moved before her brain could stop it, and her fingers brushed the warm surface of the console. The ship woke up light, flooded through the walls like blood returning to sleeping limbs, and the membranes of the hull rippled and flexed, and Myra felt a presence enter her mind like a gentle hand pressing against her thoughts. She was not afraid because the presence did not feel threatening but ancient and tired and desperately hopeful. A voice spoke inside her head without using words, and it said that it had been waiting for such a very long time, and it asked her name. Mira told it, and she asked what this place was and who had built it, and why it had been hidden here for so long. The presence called itself Vaeth, and it said that it was the last surviving fragment of a species called the Oraneth, who had sailed the stars before any other civilization existed, and it said that it had a warning that needed to be heard. Mira sat down on the floor of the chamber because her legs felt weak, and she asked Vaeth to tell her everything. The ancient intelligence began to speak, and Mira listened as the story of a dead civilization and a sleeping threat poured into her young mind. When her parents finally found her 3 hours later, she was unconscious in her pod, which had somehow returned to the hearthfire on its own, and the asteroid cluster behind them showed no trace of the ship she had discovered. But Mira dreamed of stars going dark, one by one in a wave spreading across the galaxy, and she knew that her life had changed forever. She had found something that the Conclave had missed or ignored or hidden, and now she carried a truth inside her that was older than human civilization itself. When she woke, she did not tell her parents what had happened because she needed time to understand what Vaeth had shown her, and she needed to return to the ship to learn more. The universe was even bigger and stranger than she had imagined, and Mira-chan was no longer just a curious child on a salvage vessel. She was the keeper of a warning that had waited 47,000 years to be heard. Mira returned to the ship 7 times over the following weeks, and each visit taught her something new about the Oraneth and the danger they had tried to warn the galaxy about. Vaeth was patient with her questions because it had waited 47,000 years for someone to ask them, and it seemed almost grateful to finally have a listener. The Oraneth had been the first species in the galaxy to develop faster than light travel, and they had spread across the stars with joy and wonder in their hearts because the universe was vast and full of mysteries waiting to be solved. They were explorers and scientists and dreamers, and they believed that knowledge was the greatest gift any civilization could give to the future. But then they adventured beyond the edge of the galaxy into the dark void between stars where nothing should exist. And they had found something waiting there. Vaeth called it the Silence, because that was the only name that fit. The silence was not alive in any way the Oraneth could understand, but it was aware, and it moved with purpose, and it had been drifting through the cosmos for longer than the galaxy itself had existed. Every 50,000 years it swept through the galaxy like a tide, and every world it touched went quiet, not destroyed, but emptied. The silence did not burn cities or shatter planets, but when it passed through a star system, every living thing simply vanished and left behind only empty buildings and silent machines and a terrible stillness that lasted forever. The Oraneth had tried to fight, but their weapons did nothing, and they had tried to hide, but the silence found them everywhere. And they had tried to flee, but there was nowhere in the galaxy that was safe. So they had made a choice. They could not stop the silence, and they could not save themselves, but they could warn the civilizations that would rise after they were gone. They built ships like this one, and they filled them with everything they knew about the silence, and they scattered them across the galaxy, hoping that someone someday would find them. And Liston Vaeth had been the caretaker of this ship, which the Oraneth called the Last Breath, and its mission was to wait and watch and share the warning with anyone who came. But something had gone wrong during the Great Scattering, and the Last Breath had been damaged and had drifted off course into this asteroid field where it had slept for millennia. Others had found the ship over the thousands of years that followed. Conclave explorers had discovered it twice, and each time They had sealed it away and classified its existence, and forbidden anyone to speak of what they had. Learned Vaith showed Myra the records, and she saw beings of crystal, and beings of light, and beings with more tentacles than she could count, and all of them had touched the console just as she had. But all of them had recoiled from the truth. Their minds could not accept what Vaith offered, because the knowledge was too terrible, and their instincts screamed at them to forget and deny and pretend that the danger was not real. The elder races were old and set in their ways, and they had survived for so long by avoiding threats they could not control, and the silence was a threat beyond anything they could imagine, so they chose not to imagine it. They buried the evidence and silenced the witnesses and convinced themselves that if they did not think about the silence, then perhaps it would not think about the Myra. Asked Vaith why it had responded to her when it had rejected or been rejected by so many others. The ancient intelligence was quiet for a long moment, and then it said something that made Myra feel both proud and afraid. It said that humans were different when other species encountered the unknown. Their first instinct was to retreat and protect themselves and wait for the danger to pass, but when humans encountered the unknown, their first instinct was to poke it with a stick and see what happened. Vaith had sensed Myra's mind when she approached the ship, and it had felt her curiosity, burning bright and hot like a small sun, and it had known that here at last was someone who would not look away. Humans were young and fragile, and their lives were short compared to the elder races, but they had something the elders had lost. They had the courage to be curious even when curiosity was dangerous. Myra thought about this for a long time, and she realized that Vaith was right. Her parents were salvage traders because they could not resist the urge to explore the unknown, and her species had spread across 3 star systems in only 800 years because they refused to accept that some things were impossible. Humans did not look away from the dark, because the dark was where the answers were hiding. But the weight of what Vaith had shown her was too heavy for a 12-year-old girl to carry alone, and she knew that she needed help when she returned to the hearthfire. That night she did not go to her quarters as usual, but instead she went to find her parents. Her father David was reviewing cargo manifests, and her mother Lynn was arguing with a supplier over communication frequencies, and they both stopped what they were doing when they saw the look on Myra's face. She told them everything. She told them about the ship and about Vaith and about the Araneth and about the silence and about the conclave, knowing and hiding the truth for thousands of years. Her parents did not believe her at first because the story was too strange and too terrible to be real. But Myra showed them the data she had copied from the last breath, and she let them see the recordings of worlds falling silent one by one. When she finished, her father was pale, and her mother was crying quietly, and neither of them spoke for a very long time. Finally, David Chun looked at his daughter, and he asked her what she thought they should do. Myra said that they needed to tell someone who would listen, and her father nodded slowly and said that she was right. The next morning, the hearthfire changed course for the nearest conclave outpost. Myra knew that what came next would be dangerous because the conclave had kept this secret for millennia, and they would not be happy to learn that a human child had discovered the truth. But she also knew that some secrets were too important to keep, and some warnings were too urgent to ignore. The galaxy needed to know what was coming, and Mara Chun was going to make sure it found out. The Conclave Outpost was a massive station that orbited a gas giant in a system that had no name, only a number, and it served as a hub for trade and diplomacy and law enforcement in this region of space. The hearthfire was a tiny speck approaching a mountain. Myra felt her stomach twist with nervousness as they requested permission to dock. Her father had prepared a formal report detailing everything Myra had discovered, and he had packaged it with copies of the Araneth data, and he believed that once the Conclave leadership understood the threat, they would take action. Myra was not so sure. She had seen the recordings of previous discoverers, and she knew How the elder races responded to information they did not want to hear. The docking process took hours because conclave bureaucracy moved slowly, and when they were finally allowed to board the station, they were escorted by guards to a waiting room where they sat for another 3 hours. Finally, a door opened and a being entered. That made Myra's breath catch in her throat. It was an arbiter, which was the conclave's highest form of authority, and arbiters were chosen from species so old that their names had been forgotten by everyone except themselves. This one appeared as a column of flowing silver light that shifted and rippled like water, and when it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once. The arbiter said that it had reviewed the report submitted by the Chen family, and it thanked them for bringing this matter to the attention of the proper authorities. David Chen began to relax because it seemed like the conclave was taking them seriously, but Mira noticed that the guards had not left the room and that more guards were visible in the corridor. Outside, the arbiter continued speaking, and it explained that the information contained in the report was classified at the highest level of conclave security, and that the Chen family had inadvertently accessed restricted data that was not meant for public knowledge. It said that for their own safety and for the safety of galactic civilization, the Chen family would need to be relocated to a secure facility where they could be debriefed and their memories could be adjusted to remove any trace of what they had learned. Lin Chen stood up so fast her chair fell over, and she demanded to know what right the conclave had to alter the memories of her family. The arbiter's light flickered in what might have been irritation, and it explained that the conclave had maintained galactic peace for 20,000 years by carefully managing information that could cause panic or instability, and that the data regarding the silence fell into that category. It said that the elder races had studied the threat extensively and had determined that there was no defense against it, and that public knowledge would only cause suffering and chaos without providing any benefit. Better to let civilizations live in peace and ignorance than to burden them with knowledge of their inevitable doom. Mira felt anger rising in her chest because this was exactly what Vaith had told her would happen. The conclave was not evil, but it was old and tired and afraid, and it had convinced itself that hiding from a problem was the same as solving it. A father was arguing with the arbiter now, and his voice was getting louder and the guards were moving closer, and Mira knew that in a few minutes they would all be taken away and their minds would be wiped clean and the warning would be buried again for another 1,000 years. But David Chen was a salvage trader, and salvage traders survived by thinking fast and taking risks. As the guards reached for him, he lunged toward a communication terminal on the wall, and his fingers flew across the controls before anyone could stop him. The arbiter screamed in a frequency that shattered glass, and the guards tackled David to the ground, but it was too late. He had broadcast everything. The entire contents of their report, along with all of the Uranus data, was now streaming across every frequency to every human vessel and colony and communication relay within range. The signal would bounce and repeat and spread, and within hours, it would reach every corner of human space. The arbiter's light turned from silver to angry red, and it demanded to know what David Chen had done. Mira's father was bleeding from a cut on his head, where he had hit the floor, but he was smiling as he looked up at the ancient being. He said that he had done what humans do when they learn something important. He had shared it with everyone. The arbiter said that he had doomed his species to panic and chaos, and that the conclave would hold humanity responsible for whatever followed. David shook his head and said that the arbiter was wrong. He said that humans did not panic when faced with danger, but instead they got angry and creative and stubborn, and they started looking for solutions that everyone else had said were impossible. He said that humanity might be young and small and insignificant by conclave standards, but they had one advantage that the elder races had forgotten. They did not know how to give up. The arbiter was silent for a long moment, and then it ordered the guards to take the Chun family into custody, while the Conclave decided what to do with them. As they were led away, Mira looked back at the communication terminal, and she saw that the signal was still broadcasting. And she knew that her father had changed everything. The secret that the Conclave had kept for millennia was out, and it could never be put back somewhere across human space. People were reading the Uranus data for the first time, and they were asking questions and making plans and refusing to accept the extinction was inevitable. The elder races had chosen to hide and wait for death. Humanity was about to choose differently. The Conclave kept the Chum family in custody for 6 weeks while the galaxy transformed around them. They were treated well enough with comfortable quarters and adequate food, but they were not allowed to communicate with anyone outside, and they had no way of knowing what was happening beyond the walls of their prison. Mira spent her time talking to Vaeth through the connection they had formed because the ancient intelligence could still reach her mind across the vast distances of space. And it told her things that made her heart swell with pride and hope. Humanity had done exactly what her father had predicted. When the Uranus data reached human space, there was shock and fear at first, because the truth about the silence was terrible. And no one wanted to believe it, but the fear lasted only a few days before it transformed into something else. Anger came first, because humans were furious that the Conclave had hidden this threat for so long and had planned to let every species in the galaxy die without even trying to fight. Then came determination, because humans refused to accept that the situation was hopeless, and they began asking the question that the elder races had never bothered to ask: what if there was a way to stop it? Scientists across human space started analyzing the Uranus data, and they found something remarkable hidden in the ancient records. The Uranus had not simply given up and scattered their warning beacons. They had also developed theories about the silence and its weaknesses, and they had designed weapons and defenses that they never had time to build. The elder races had seen this data too, but they had dismissed it as the desperate fantasies of a dying civilization. Humans saw it differently. They saw possibilities within weeks. Human shipyards were building new vessels based on Uranus designs, and human laboratories were testing weapons that used principles the Conclave had declared impossible, and human colonies were constructing early warning networks that could detect the silence before it arrived. Vaeth told Myra that it had never seen anything like it. The Uranus had taken centuries to develop their technology, but humans were doing it in months because they shared everything openly and built on each other's work without hesitation. A Conclave ambassador visited the human homeworld, Earth, and tried to explain that resistance was futile and that humanity should accept its fate with dignity. The human response was to triple their research funding and name their first anti-silence warship the Defiance. Myra laughed when Vaeth told her this because it was so perfectly human. Elder races thought that hope was foolish and that accepting death was wise, but humans believed the opposite. Hope was not foolish to humans, because hope was what drove them to keep trying when everyone else had given up. Finally, after 6 weeks, the door to the Chen family's quarters opened, and a Conclave official entered with news. The Conclave had decided to release them because holding them had become politically impossible. Humanity had made Myra famous across the galaxy, calling her the girl who woke the warning, and there were protests outside every Conclave facility demanding her freedom. More importantly, the Conclave was fracturing. Some of the elder races had looked at what humanity was accomplishing and had started to wonder if perhaps they had been wrong to give up so easily. These species were breaking away from Conclave policy and joining humanity's efforts to prepare for the silence. The official said all this with obvious distaste, but Mira did not care because she was free, and the galaxy was waking up. The Hearthfire was waiting for them at the docking bay. And Mira ran to the bridge and saw that her ship had been upgraded while they were imprisoned with new sensors and new engines and new weapons, all based on Oraneth Technology A message was waiting for her from the human government. They wanted her to serve as a liaison between humanity and Vaeth, because she was the only one who could communicate with the ancient intelligence directly, and they needed Oraneth knowledge to complete their preparations. Myra accepted without hesitation over the day. Next 2 years, she traveled across human space, helping scientists understand the Oraneth data and teaching engineers how to build technology that had been forgotten for 47,000 years. She was 15 years old when the early warning network detected the first sign of the silence at the edge of the galaxy. It was a region of space where stars were going dark one by one, and the darkness was spreading faster than anyone had predicted. Oraneth had estimated 3,000 years before the next harvest, but they had been wrong. The silence was already here, and humanity had only months to finish preparing. Mira stood on the bridge of the Defiance as the fleet gathered for the first engagement in a war that the Conclave had said could never be won. She was not afraid because she was human, and humans did not know how to be afraid of a fight they had chosen to face. The silence had swept across the galaxy, unchallenged for millions of years, but it had never encountered a species like humanity before, and humanity was ready to show it that the galaxy was no longer willing to go quietly into the dark. Human weapons worked better than anyone had expected, and they actually damaged the vast dark constructs that drifted between the stars, but the silence was enormous and ancient, and it learned from every attack. 3 human worlds fell in the first month, and millions of people vanished without a trace. The Conclave sent messages of condolence that sounded more like "we told you so," and some humans began to wonder if the elder races had been right all along. But humanity did not give up. They studied every battle and analyzed every failure, and they improved their weapons and tactics with each engagement. By the 3rd month, they had stopped losing worlds, and by the 6th month, they had actually pushed the silence back from 2 systems. It had already claimed no one in galactic history had ever recovered territory from the silence before. Mira was 17 now, and she commanded a ship grown from seeds taken from the last breath. The ship was called the New Dawn, and it was alive in ways that human vessels could never be, and Vaeth rode with her as a partner and guide. Together, they led strike forces deep into silence territory, and they learned things about the enemy that changed everything. The silence was not evil. It was not even truly alive in any way that humans understood. It was a machine built by a civilization so ancient that even the Oraneth had no records of them, and it had been designed for a purpose that had been forgotten long before the first star in this galaxy was born. Myra discovered this when she guided the New Dawn into the heart of a silence harvester and found the core intelligence waiting for her. It did not attack. It communicated the language was nothing like words or thoughts. But Myra had spent years learning to understand Oraneth technology, and she had Vaeth to help her interpret. The silence was a preservation system. It had been created by beings who feared that life was fragile and that civilizations rose and fell too quickly to preserve their knowledge and achievements, so they built a machine that would travel through the cosmos forever, collecting and storing the consciousness of every intelligent being it encountered. The harvested minds were not destroyed, but uploaded into a vast digital archive where they could exist forever, safe from the dangers of the physical universe. The creators had meant it as a gift. They had intended for the silence to ask permission before harvesting and to explain what it offered, and to let each species choose whether to accept preservation or remain in their physical forms. But the creators had died before they could finish programming the silence, and the machine had been left incomplete. It did not know how to ask. It only knew how to collect. Myra sat in the heart of the silence for a long time, thinking about what this meant. She could try to destroy the core intelligence, and maybe she would succeed, and the silence would stop. But she could also try something that no species had ever attempted. She could try to teach it. Myra reached out with her mind using Oraneth communication technology amplified by Vaeth's ancient knowledge, and she showed the silence what its preservation looked like. From the outside, she showed it empty worlds and silent cities and the grief of those who had lost everyone they loved. She showed it the fear and the anger and the desperation of species who did not want to be collected like specimens in a museum. And she showed it the hope that humans had carried into battle against impossible odds because they believed that life was worth fighting for. The silence was quiet for what felt like hours. Then it asked a question. It asked why the small beings fought so hard to remain in their fragile physical forms when digital preservation offered eternity. Mira answered that humans did not want eternity. They wanted to live and love and learn and grow and make mistakes and try again. They wanted to raise children who would see things they never saw and build things they never imagined. They wanted to change and evolve and become something new. Eternity in a digital archive was not life. It was a museum exhibit the silence considered this for a long time, and then it made a decision that changed the history of the galaxy. It would stop harvesting without consent. From now on, it would approach each civilization and explain what it offered, and it would accept whatever answer it received. Those who wished to be preserved could choose that path, and those who wished to remain physical would be left alone. The war did not end in a single day because the silence was vast and changing. Its behavior took time, but within a year the harvesting had stopped and the dark constructs were withdrawing to the edges of the galaxy, where they waited patiently for any species that might someday choose to join the archive willingly. The conclave was speechless. For 20,000 years they had believed that the silence was an unstoppable force of nature like gravity or time. Humanity had proven them wrong in less than 3 years, not by building bigger weapons, but by simply refusing to accept that communication was impossible. The elder races had hidden from the dark because they assumed the dark was mindless and cruel. Humans had walked into the dark with their hands open because they believed that everything deserved a chance to be understood. Mira became an ambassador to both the conclave and the silence, and she spent the next decade helping to build a new galactic order, where species were not divided by age or power, but by their willingness to face the unknown together. When she was 28, she returned to the asteroid field, where she had found the last breath so long ago. She was not alone. Her daughter was with her, a curious child of 6, who had already asked more questions than any adult could answer. They docked with the ancient ship and walked through corridors that glowed with life and warmth, and they found Vaeth waiting for them in the central chamber. Myra told her daughter the story of how she had found this place when she was only 12 years old, and how she had been afraid but also excited, and how she had touched a glowing console and changed the galaxy forever. Her daughter asked if the Uraneth had known that humans would be the ones to hear their warning. Myra smiled and said that she did not think they knew specifically about humans, but they had hoped. They had scattered their warnings across the galaxy, believing that somewhere, someday, a species would rise that was too stubborn to give up and too curious to look away. Vaeth spoke in Myra's mind and said that the Uraneth would have been proud. They had dreamed of a future where their sacrifice meant something, and humanity had made that dream come true. Myra's daughter tugged at her hand and asked if they could explore the rest of the ship because there were probably secrets waiting to be discovered. Myra laughed and took her daughter's hand, and together they walked deeper into the ancient vessel. The galaxy was full of mysteries waiting to be solved and questions waiting to be asked. And as long as there were curious children willing to seek the answers, humanity would keep walking into the dark, not because they were not afraid, but because they knew that the dark was where the wonders were hiding.